The mansion stood silent beneath the soft morning light, its marble floors gleaming like frozen rivers, its chandeliers still glittering from last night's gala. For most of the staff, it was another day of endless work, cleaning up after a world they could never belong to. But for Grace, it was a world she entered not for ambition or envy, but survival. She was 32, a widow and a mother of one. Her son Malik was only 2 when her husband died in a construction accident. With no family to turn to, she'd taken whatever job she could find, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, ironing suits that cost more than her entire year's rent. And when she'd landed a housekeeping job at the home of Alexander Steele, the reclusive billionaire everyone in New York whispered about, she thanked God every morning for the chance to feed her child. Alexander Steele was everything people said about him. Brilliant, cold, untouchable. At 40, he'd built an empire in tech and finance that stretched across continents. But behind the luxury, he lived in silence, haunted by a tragedy that had hollowed him from within. His wife, Lily, had passed away during childbirth 2 years ago, leaving him with a son, Ethan, whom he adored but couldn't seem to face. Every time he looked into Ethan's blue-gray eyes, he saw Lily's. And so, while nannies came and went, the little boy grew up surrounded by wealth but starved for affection. Grace had noticed it from her first week, how the boy cried in his crib long after the nannies had left for the night, how his tiny hands reached for a mother who wasn't there. And though it wasn't her place, she couldn't ignore the ache in her heart. She'd had milk left after weaning Malik, and some nights, when the boy's cries echoed through the grand halls, she'd sneak into the nursery and hold him, rocking, whispering lullabies, feeding him when no one else would. She did it not for thanks, but because it was what mothers did. She thought no one would ever know. Until one morning, he did. It was early, the kind of dawn that painted the sky with soft gold. Grace had just finished dusting the library when she heard the familiar sound, Ethan's soft whimpering through the baby monitor. The new nanny had called in sick again, and instinctively Grace went upstairs. She found the baby restless, tears rolling down his cheeks, his tiny hands clutching at the air. Without thinking, she scooped him into her arms, humming the same hymn her mother once sang in Alabama. The boy calmed. His little head rested against her chest, and before long he was drinking quietly, eyes fluttering closed. Grace smiled through tears she didn't understand. For a moment, she wasn't a maid. She was simply a woman holding a child who needed love. But then, behind her, she heard a voice, Grace. "What are you doing?" The words sliced through the silence. She froze, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She turned, and there he was. Alexander Steele, standing in the doorway, expression unreadable. The morning light framed him like judgment itself. His suit was half-buttoned, his tie loose. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a broken man who just stumbled upon a truth he didn't know how to process. "Mr. Steele, I'm sorry, sir," Grace stammered, her voice trembling. "He was crying, and the nanny wasn't here, and I just wanted to help." He raised a hand, stopping her. His eyes weren't angry, just lost. "You were nursing him?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Yes, sir. I know it's not my place. Please forgive me. I didn't mean any disrespect. I just couldn't watch him cry like that." The room was heavy with silence. Alexander looked at the child in her arms, peaceful now, sleeping soundly for perhaps the first time in days. Something inside him twisted. He hadn't been able to soothe his own son in months. No nanny could. But this woman, this maid, had done it without effort, without expectation, without payment. "Just love." He stepped forward slowly. "You feed him often?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Only when he cries at night." "I know it's wrong, but sometimes love don't ask for permission, sir. It just moves your heart before your mind can stop it." The words hung in the air like music. Alexander sat down in the chair beside the crib. For the first time in years, he really looked at his son. His tiny fingers, his soft breathing, the innocence that didn't understand loneliness or wealth. And for a moment he felt something break open inside him. He whispered, "You've done more for him than I have." Grace shook her head quickly. "No, sir. You're his father. He just misses a touch he can't name." Alexander looked up. "And you gave him that," She lowered her gaze, ready for the words she expected next. "You're fired. Pack your things, leave," but they never came. Instead, he said quietly, "Grace, would you sit with me for a moment?" She hesitated, then nodded. He watched her cradle Ethan, rocking gently. "You remind me of her," he said softly. "My wife, Lily, she was warm like you. Always giving. I thought if I buried myself in work, I could protect Ethan from feeling what I feel. But I only made him lonelier." Grace's voice was tender. "You can't protect him from pain, sir, but you can love him through it. That's what matters." Alexander looked at her and for the first time truly saw her, not as a maid, but as a woman with strength carved by struggle. "Grace, do you have a child?" Her eyes softened. "Yes, sir, Malik, he's 5. Sweetest boy you'll ever meet. I work hard so he can dream bigger than I ever could." There was a silence between them, not awkward, but sacred. Two souls from different worlds, united by something more powerful than status, human compassion. That day marked a quiet change in the house. Alexander began spending more time with Ethan. He'd watch how Grace held the baby, how she spoke to him, and slowly he learned. He began feeding Ethan himself, reading to him, taking him on walks through the garden. Grace became more than staff. She became a teacher, not of academics, but of heart. One evening, as the city lights shimmered beyond the window, Alexander called Grace into his study. She feared the worst. Perhaps her kindness had crossed a line again. But when she entered, he was smiling. "Grace, I made a decision," he said. "I want to fund a community center in Harlem. For single mothers, for children who need care, support, safety. I'll name it after my wife. And you." Her breath caught. "Sir, I don't deserve that." He shook his head. "You reminded me what love looks like when it has nothing to gain. That's what this world needs more of. That's what Lily believed in." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "You don't know what this means to me." He smiled faintly. "Oh, I do. Because you saved not just my son. You saved me, months past." The mansion no longer felt cold. Laughter filled its halls. Ethan's giggles, Grace's songs, even Malik's footsteps when he came to visit. The billionaire who once hid behind wealth now spent his mornings on the floor, building blocks with his boy. And when the press learned of the new Lily and Grace Foundation, people were stunned. Not by the size of his donation, but by the story behind it. They asked, "Why her?" And Alexander answered simply, "Because she taught me that love has no rank, no race, no uniform. It's the only thing that makes us human." Years later, at the opening ceremony of the community center, Grace stood beside Alexander on stage, holding her son's hand. Ethan, now a bright little boy, ran up and hugged her tightly. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, but Grace didn't see any of that. She saw only the 2 children, one born to wealth, the other to struggle, playing together without a care in the world. Alexander leaned toward her and said quietly, "You know, when I first saw you holding him, I thought you were breaking a rule. Now I realize you were rewriting one." Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Sometimes, sir, love breaks rules to make room for miracles." The audience rose to their feet in applause. It wasn't for the money or the building, or the billionaire's generosity. It was for the story that reminded them all of something simple and sacred. Humanity still existed in the smallest acts of courage and compassion. In the years that followed, Grace became the director of the foundation. She helped hundreds of women like herself, mothers who'd lost everything yet refused to stop giving. Alexander continued his work, but he did it differently now, with purpose, with heart. And every year, on the anniversary of Lily's passing, he, Grace, and their children would visit the garden behind the center, where a single plaque stood, "For Lily and Grace, 2 women who taught me that love is stronger than loss." Standing there, Grace would often whisper a prayer of gratitude, not for wealth or recognition, but for the simple miracle of connection that had changed all their lives. Because in the end, she knew what many had forgotten. Kindness is not charity. It's the bridge between souls, and sometimes all it takes to heal a broken world is one act of selfless love, seen by the right pair of eyes at the right moment. That was how a billionaire found his heart again. That was how a maid became a miracle, and that was how love, unexpected, uninvited, unspoken, rewrote the story of 2 worlds that were never meant to meet. but did. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, painting golden streaks across the marble floor. The mansion was quiet, as if holding its breath after the storm of yesterday's gala. Silver trays glimmered, untouched champagne glasses stood like frozen laughter, and somewhere in that grand silence, a small baby's cry pierced through. Grace Johnson stopped what she was doing. Her hands, still gloved with soap and water, trembled. It was Ethan, Mr. Steele's son. She hesitated only a moment before running up the wide staircase. The sound grew louder, sharp, aching, desperate. When she entered the nursery, she found the boy kicking, his cheeks flushed with exhaustion. The nanny's room next door was empty again. Grace's heart broke. She picked him up gently, whispering, "Shh, baby boy, it's okay. I got you now." And in that quiet moment, instinct took over. Motherhood took over. She sat in the rocking chair, held him close, and began to nurse him. The boy's cries melted into small sighs of peace. His tiny fingers gripped her apron, as if afraid she might disappear too. Grace hummed a lullaby from her childhood, one her mother used to sing in the warm Alabama nights. She forgot the marble, the chandeliers, the titles. She forgot she was just the maid. She was simply a mother, filling a silence no one else had noticed. Then, a voice quiet, deep, unmistakable. "Grace, what are you doing?" Her heart nearly stopped. She turned slowly, and there he was, Alexander Steele. The billionaire. The man whose name could move markets. Now standing frozen at the door of his own nursery. He looked at her, at his son, as at what she was doing. For a moment, the entire world went still. Grace rose to her feet, tears already forming. "Mr. Steele, I'm sorry." He was crying, "Sir. No one was here. I just wanted to help. Please forgive me." Alexander didn't speak. His eyes weren't filled with anger. They were filled with something else. He took a slow step forward. "You were nursing him?" Grace nodded, trembling. "Yes, sir. I know it wasn't my place. But sometimes when a baby cries like that, you don't think, you just love." The words struck him, hard. He looked at his son's sleeping face, soft and peaceful, and something inside him broke. He hadn't seen Ethan this calm in weeks. Alexander sat down beside her, voice barely above a whisper. "You've done what I couldn't." Grace looked down. "No, sir. You're his father. He just needs a mother's warmth." Alexander's throat tightened. He hadn't heard that word, mother, in years without pain. "Do you have children, Grace?" "Yes, sir. One boy, Malik. He's 5. Smart as a whip, but I can't afford the good schools yet. I work hard, so maybe one day he'll never have to choose between love and survival." Alexander's eyes softened. He realized this woman. This maid had more wealth in her heart than he had in all his banks combined. That morning, something shifted inside him. He didn't fire her. He didn't scold her. He simply said, "Stay." And that was how healing began. Over the next few weeks, the mansion changed. Ethan laughed more. The air felt lighter. Alexander began to join them, awkwardly at first, then naturally. He watched how Grace spoke to Ethan, how she looked into his eyes when she talked to him, as if he were the only soul on earth that mattered. It humbled him. It taught him what love looked like when it wasn't rehearsed. One night, while Ethan slept, Alexander found Grace in the kitchen, finishing dishes. He stood there for a while before saying, "You've done more for my son than any doctor, any nanny, any therapist. You've given him love." Grace smiled faintly. "Love don't need permission, sir. Just finds the cracks and fills them." He swallowed hard. "Would you teach me how to love him like that?" That night, Grace taught a billionaire how to hold his child, how to hum, how to listen, how to just be there. And for the first time, Alexander felt his son's heartbeat against his chest and realized how much life he'd missed hiding behind his grief. Months later, he called Grace into his office. She entered nervously, clutching her apron. "Is everything all right, sir?" He smiled, a soft, unfamiliar smile. "I'm creating a foundation," he said, "for mothers like you, for families who need help, safety, and a chance. I want to name it after my wife." "And you," Grace froze. "After me? No, sir. You're not just anything," he interrupted gently. You reminded me what love looks like when it's real. You've given me back my son. You've given me back my life." Her eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Steele, that's more than I ever dreamed of." He smiled. "It's what you deserve." The story spread faster than wildfire. When the media discovered the Lily and Grace Foundation, they were stunned, not by the size of the donation, but by the reason. Behind it, a billionaire changed forever because of the kindness of his maid. When reporters asked him why her, Alexander simply said, "Because she taught me that love has no rank, no race, and no price tag. It's the only thing that makes us human." Years passed. Grace became the director of the foundation. Malik grew up to be a young man with dreams of becoming a doctor. Ethan grew into a kind, curious boy who called Grace his Auntie G. The mansion that once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter. Shared meals, messy art projects, bedtime stories, and the sound of a father and son rediscovering joy. Every year, on the anniversary of Lily's death, Alexander, Grace, and their 2 boys visited the community center together. In the garden stood a bronze plaque that read, "For Lily and Grace, 2 women who taught me that love is stronger than loss." And every time Grace saw it, she smiled through her tears, because she understood now. Life doesn't always give you wealth or ease, but sometimes it gives you moments where love steps beyond fear, moments where the heart, not the wallet, saves a soul. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the skyline, Alexander turned to Grace in the garden. "You know," he said softly, "the day I saw you holding my son, I thought you'd broken a rule." Grace laughed. "Maybe I did," he smiled back. "No, you didn't break a rule. You rewrote one." She looked at him, her eyes warm and steady. "Sometimes, sir, love has to break rules to make room for miracles." He nodded. "You were my miracle, Grace." And as the 2 children played in the background, their laughter echoing through the air, the billionaire and the maid stood side by side, not as boss and servant, but as family. 2 worlds that were never meant to meet had found each other in the purest way possible, through love that expected nothing and gave everything. True kindness doesn't ask who deserves it. It simply gives. Wealth can build walls, but love tears them down. And sometimes the most powerful change begins in the quietest act of compassion, a mother's touch, a child's cry, and a heart finally learning how to feel again. Because in the end, it wasn't the billionaire who saved the maid. It was the maid who saved the billionaire. And together, they saved something even greater. Hope 5 years later, the world knew the name Lily and Grace Foundation. What began as a single act of compassion inside one mansion had become a movement that reached across cities and hearts. The foundation now funded housing for single mothers, childcare programs, education scholarships, and food drives in the poorest neighborhoods of New York. And at the center of it all stood Grace Johnson, the woman who once scrubbed marble floors for survival, now standing behind podiums to speak about faith, dignity, and the power of love. Her voice carried strength, but also humility. She never spoke about herself as a savior, only as a woman who had once been saved by kindness and chose to pass it on. Alexander Steele always sat in the front row at her events. He never interrupted, never tried to take the spotlight. He watched quietly, his eyes often glistening with a pride that went beyond words. He'd built companies that changed industries, but it was Grace who changed lives. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Grace stopped by the old mansion. It no longer felt intimidating. The place that once symbolized distance and hierarchy had become home, a space filled with children's laughter and the aroma of home-cooked. Malik, now 10, was tutoring Ethan, who had inherited his father's sharp mind, but his mother's kindness. They sat at the same dining table where billion-dollar deals had once been discussed, now scattered with crayons, textbooks, and half-eaten sandwiches. Grace stood by the doorway, smiling. Her eyes met Alexander's across the room. No words were needed. Later that night, as they sat on the veranda overlooking the city lights, Alexander broke the silence. "Grace," he said quietly, "you know, people still ask me why I trust you so much. Why I let you run everything? I tell them. Because you gave me something no one else could. Grace chuckled softly. And what's that, sir? He turned toward her, his voice thick with emotion. You taught me how to be human again. She looked at him, eyes gentle. No, sir. You already were. You just forgot. He smiled faintly. You always say that, she nodded. Because it's true. Pain makes people forget who they are. Love helps them remember. They sat in silence again. The city glowing below. The stars hung high. Quiet witnesses to a miracle born of humility. A few weeks later, Grace found herself standing on a stage at the United Nations Women's Summit. She had been invited to speak. Her story had gone viral, inspiring millions. As she stood at the podium, the cameras flashed. The audience hushed. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with reverence. I'm not a politician, she began. I'm not an academic. I'm just a woman who once cleaned a house that wasn't mine. But one day I saw a child crying, and I did what any mother would do. I held him. The audience was silent. That moment changed everything, she continued. Because love doesn't care about status, skin color, or salary. Love only asks, will you see me as human? Will you hold me when I cry? Will you care when no one else will? Her voice broke slightly. I did not know that one act would change my life or his. But maybe that's how God works. Not through grand gestures, but through small, quiet mercies that ripple out until they reach the whole world. Applause erupted, people stood, and among them, Alexander Steele wiped a tear from his cheek, whispering under his breath. Lily would be proud. When Grace stepped off the stage, Alexander was waiting. He didn't say a word. He just hugged her, a long, unguarded hug that said everything words could not. Thank you, he whispered. For what? She asked softly. For reminding me that love isn't weakness. It's the greatest strength a man can have. That night after the gala, Grace and her son Malik took a cab back to their small apartment in Harlem. Though she could easily afford to move now, she chose to stay among her people, her roots, her beginnings. As Malik dozed off beside her, she looked out at the passing city lights and thought about everything that had changed. Not just for her, but for the thousands of families now given hope. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not for fame or wealth, but for purpose. She whispered a quiet prayer. Thank you, Lord, for trusting me with love. Years passed, Alexander grew older, but his heart grew softer. Ethan, now a teenager, carried Grace's compassion in his soul. Malik graduated top of his class, with Alexander secretly funding his education, a gesture Grace only discovered years later. When Malik received his medical degree, the two families gathered again, in the same garden behind the foundation, beneath the plaque that bore their names. For Lily and Grace, two women who taught me that love is stronger than loss. Malik placed a single white rose beneath it. Ethan knelt beside him. Two boys, one born into wealth, one born into struggle, now brothers by choice. Not blood. Alexander stood beside Grace, his hair now streaked with silver. He looked at the plaque, then at her. You know, he said softly. I used to think money could fix anything. Now I know only love can. Grace smiled, eyes glistening. That's what I've been trying to tell you all along. He chuckled. You were right. You always were. They stood in silence, watching their sons laugh in the garden where it all began. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander said one last thing, something he'd never said before. Grace, you're not just the woman who saved my son. You're the reason I became the father he deserved. Her heart filled with warmth. She looked at him and whispered, and you, sir, are the proof that no soul is too lost to love again. When Alexander passed away years later, the world mourned the billionaire philanthropist who had transformed his empire into a force for good. But when reporters asked Grace how she would remember him, she said simply, as a man who remembered how to love because someone dared to love him first. At the funeral, Ethan delivered his father's final message, written in his own hand. If you ever doubt the power of compassion, remember Grace Johnson. She entered my home as a maid and left as my teacher. She showed me that love is not something you earn. It's something you give. Freely, fearlessly, endlessly. The audience wept, and in that moment, Grace understood. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, plants a seed that grows beyond our sight. She had only wanted to comfort a crying child, but that small act had changed an empire and healed a heart that once seemed unbreakable. Final message: love can change anyone. One act of compassion can rewrite an entire story. And when we choose to care, when we dare to love beyond fear, beyond judgment, beyond boundaries, we become the miracle someone else has been praying for. Because in the end, it wasn't wealth that built the world, it was love, it always was.